Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about Azure Storage Actions, a capability that's currently in preview that gives me a lot more power and flexibility when I think of performing operations on the data in my storage accounts. Now, if I think about a storage account, they're a very capable type of resource we have in Azure. So I think about I create my particular storage account, which lives in a specific region. And then within that storage account, there's a lot of different types of data that I can handle. I can have key value pairs of data by storing it in tables. I can support simple messaging with queues. We have file-based protocol support. I could be SMB, it could be NFS with files. And then, of course, we have Blob. And Blob is one of those super flexible capabilities that I could store media files, I can store documents, I can store semi-structured data. I can really put whatever I want into that. And I can use the blob area of my storage account in one of two ways. Because when I create a storage account, I have the default. And the default is it's just a flat namespace. So with a flat namespace, although we may think we have a directory structure with our blobs, it looks like there's folders, there's not really. It is just the visualization says, oh, there's a slash there. Let's make it look like it's a folder, but it's all one big flat file space. Any structure is just a part of the name of the blob, which means if I perform folder level operations, it's actually having to operate on each of the blobs, maybe copy the blob to a new file name. There's challenges with that. But I can also on the storage account enable a hierarchical namespace. HNS. So we run it in one of these two modes, and that hierarchical namespace is really a data lake. The Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, that's now a storage account where I've enabled this hierarchical namespace. So this is what we get for a data lake. And that obviously the hierarchical namespace has true folders. I can operate at an atomic level on a directory type operation. I can support directory targeted tasks. Moving files is just a metadata task now, so it's super fast. I can rename a folder, delete it. I have POSIX style ACLs. So there's a lot of capability in that data lake. Now, not every feature of the flat namespace is supported. We can always go and look. And I'm pointing this out because later on when we start talking about performing tasks, it's important to understand that hierarchical namespace doesn't have all the features. So if I look at the hierarchical namespace, for example, I'm looking at this column, well, it doesn't have things like blob index tags, but also it doesn't have things like versions. It doesn't have things like the change feed. So that feature, obviously, if I want to perform an action on a data lake, well, I can't do things around versioning. So it's just important to realize that, hey, I have this great data lake capability, but not every feature of Blob is supported on it. Huge scale, fantastic for storing pretty much anything I want. So what's the challenge? Well, if you look today at how customers are using Blob, there is just this huge growth. So there's a huge growth in the volume of data. So if I look at, well, how much data do I have? A few years ago, oh, you have 1 billion blobs. That's a lot of blobs you have there. Now there are storage accounts with hundreds of billions of blobs. So that sheer volume of data has just exploded. And when you start getting into the concept of hundreds of billions, even trying to call something like an Azure function, even Data Factory at that volume, it can start to become problematic. The other thing is, some organizations, they'll create a big data lake. So then maybe they'll create a data lake for EMEA, for APAC, for US, whatever that might be. But then I might have lots of different data sets within that single data lake. So I've got that data set, I've got this data set, you get the idea. I have lots of different data sets all within a single data lake. Or I may want to perform different types of things on that. So I might have a mix of media files, documents, telemetry data, financial data. I know organizations that sometimes you phone up and it says, hey, we're going to record this call for training purposes, and you ignore it. Well, companies actually do that, and they might store it in a data lake. That one company, well, they may get phone calls about modifying something about my profile. Well, that's PII. So there might be regulations that say, well, you can't keep that more than, 28 days. But also maybe I'm doing a financial transaction. Well, now that call, maybe I have to keep it for 7 years. So I get this combination of different requirements, but I'm putting it all in this same data lake. And the agent would tag the data with PII or financial or something else. So what I'm getting here is potentially, I get this huge complexity. Because when I want to think about doing things to the data, I've got this huge mix. So I need to somehow think about working on a subset. So within this data, there's going to be some subset criteria that I want to be able to act on. Maybe it's this set of conditions based on the name, maybe the extension type, maybe some tagging I have, but it's some characteristics that's going to represent the full fidelity of what I actually want to do. And I don't want to have some really high development effort to make that. And then I might have the opposite end of the spectrum. So this was one big data lake. Well, the other end of the spectrum is I end up with these islands. So now I've got just lots and lots of little islands of all the different sets of data I have. And that might seem, well, that's great. I've got all these different islands all over the place. But now imagine there's hundreds. Now imagine there's thousands of those. And now what I want is to perform some common sets of actions against them. So I've got all this mismatch, but I want common tasks. I want the ability to say, hey, I'm going to define these rules. And even though I've got 1,000 different storage accounts or little lakes around my environment, I don't want to have to define them on every single one of those. I want some central management around it. So that can be a challenge for a lot of organizations as well. And then I can think about, well, what is it I want to be able to do? So for all of these different datas over here, I have different type of action that I may want to do. Now, one of the great things we see with just regular blob is tiering. And very, very commonly, we think about optimizing our cost. So I might think about, well, I want to change the tier. Hey, I've not used this data for 30 days. Let's move it from hot to cool. Hey, I've not used it for 90 days. Let's move it from cool to cold. Hey, I've not used it for 6 months. Let's move it to archive. Maybe, hey, I need to delete this data. Well, after so many days, let's go and delete it. And they're very common ones we always think about, but realize there are other ones as well. It must be kept for a certain amount of time. So I may have requirements around immutability. Maybe I actually need to go and undelete some piece of data. Maybe I want to go and add a tag based on some operation I perform. And there might be other types of actions I want to do. So there's all these different combinations of things I might want to do and different combinations of criteria on my data. And so if I boil this down, if I look at where I am on this, my biggest challenges today is based on the sheer scale of the amount of data I have. And I need the flexibility. These are the things that I need to solve to make this efficient in my environment? I need to be able to target a subset when I have lots of different data sets in one place. I need to be able to handle maybe hundreds of billions of blobs. And I need to be able to do it in such a way that, hey, if there are these little silos, I can still centrally define my rules. And if I think about those challenges, realize the Azure Storage team have had to solve for that because obviously they create these services. The storage team have handled massive volumes because they have to do garbage collection. They have to do billing on all of the data. They have to be able to support continuation. So I'm doing something, I leave it, and then I have to be able to pick it back up and carry on with that. So we want to solve these challenges. Now, the video is on Azure Storage Actions, but you may be saying, there's already a solution for this. I've seen this before. I know there's lifecycle management. And so yes, absolutely, we have lifecycle management. So if I think about a storage account, let's pick a certain color. So if we have a storage account, so we have this boundary of the storage account. One of the things that I can do is I can define a lifecycle management policy. And I can define n number of these. What I do is I specify a filter. Now, again, this is existing within the specific storage account. And I go in and I can set a filter. Now, my filter can be based on a prefix. So, hey, it starts, I'm not spelling that right at all, prefix. It can be based on a prefix. It can also be based on blob index tag. And this can work on the flat namespace. This can work on the hierarchical namespace. And then once I define that filter, I can perform certain tasks. Now, the only tasks I can support is change tier and delete. So that's what I can do with the lifecycle management policies. So it's fairly restrictive in what I can actually work on. I can't support wildcard or question mark to do something around a single character. It's very much a hammer. It's not super flexible. It's really designed and it's free. I mean, I guess that's an important point to point out about this. Lifecycle management, hey, it's free. It's a built-in capability in the storage account. Let's actually go and take a look at it. If we jump over, looking at my storage account, within my data management, I have the option to create lifecycle management policies. So I can go into this. I've got a few here already, but just to say, hey, I can add a rule. I give it a name. Notice what I can target. It could be all of them, or I could limit it with filters, and we'll do the filter. I can do block blobs and append blobs. I can do things based on the base, the snapshots, the versions. I can base it on modified, created, accessed. If I want to do the accessed, I have to have enabled access time tracking. These are all based in some number of days. And then my actions are all based around delete or moving between the tiers. So I can go and select those things. Let's just say 30 days for now. And then assuming I did say limit with filters, well, then I can enter prefixes. I can base it on a blob key. So it's a nice, very basic option we have there, but it is just based on, hey, I can work on a prefix. I can work on a blob index tag value, and then I can move it around the tiers or I can delete it. But that is not going to handle the more complicated sets of criteria I'm going to need if I have lots of different data sets within my data lake. I may need to do other types of actions beyond just change tier and delete. But if I do just, hey, I'm doing a cost optimization exercise, I just want to move everything over a certain amount of days to a different tier, or I just need to delete stuff over a certain age, hey, this is a nice solution. It's free. So don't think, oh, this is something I'm not going to use anymore. But it's a hammer. And sometimes I don't want a hammer. Sometimes I need a chisel. I need to be a little bit more granular. And this is where Azure Storage Actions comes in. It's designed to handle these potentially very complex types of scenarios where I have to have very, very granular criteria. It's designed to handle this massive scale, and it's designed to handle these full sets of different types of API actions I can perform against my blobs. So this is the goal for this. So how do we go about using these? So the key thing, and obviously this will start to shine through, I'm not creating these in a storage account. So if I think about my Azure Storage Actions, the way I start off is, well, firstly, this is going to work for any blob, and that it supports both the flat namespace and the hierarchical namespace. So it's any blob. I'm going to go and create a storage task. And I can create n numbers of tasks to do different things. Now, once I create the storage task, there's 3 key groupings of things that I have to do as part of it. I'm not going to be writing code. I'm going to define everything I want to do in terms of the actual business logic I want. And we're going to see I have this full range of flexibility in the actions I perform, but obviously realize, remember, hierarchical namespace didn't support versioning. So if I define some operation as manipulating versions, for example, in the future, that wouldn't work against the hierarchical namespace that doesn't support versionings. But create my storage task. The first thing I'm going to define are my conditions. So to what is this going to apply? And I do this by creating one or more clauses. And a clause is really, and we see this time and time again, the clause is going to be based on some property with some operator, equals, less than, and then some value. Now, this value might be an absolute I'm putting in. This value may come from maybe a tag on something. It might be some expression, but I have a lot of flexibility around this. I have the ability to group these clauses. So maybe it's, hey, this or this, and then it's, hey, with some other group of things. So let's actually go through and look at this in order. So if I jump over again, so what we're going to do is we search for storage actions. So obviously I've got these already because I've been playing around with it. And the first thing we have to do is go and create a task. Now we can also see that actions, I can view my storage tasks over here. Now I've got 2. So I could just go ahead and create a brand new one. If I create a brand new one, I'm going to go and create it. It's a Azure resource. So it would go in a certain resource group. It would live in a certain region and it would have a certain name. And then after I define that, I would go and define these conditions, assignments, and I can set tags on this Azure resource, the task itself. Now, I've already created this, and we'll see the same options. So I've created it. So the first thing we would have done is create the conditions. So let's give ourselves a bit more space. Okay, so what we can see here is we start off with this visual builder, and it's if. So this is a very common if then, and maybe even if then else. Now I've got 4 different things going on here. I'm looking up blob name ends with JPEG, blob name ends with GIF, the creation time is earlier than 60 days ago, and the blob name matches, and notice I can use wildcards. So wildcard is any number of characters, a question mark would just be 1 character. So I can use those within here. And what you can actually see I've done is for these first 2, I have grouped them. So if I selected those 2, notice here I could ungroup and then I could select them again. And now we see the group is available to me. And so I group them. So it's the name ends with JPEG or GIF or GIF, whatever your preferred approach is there. And it's older than 60 days. And the blob name matches this. Now I could add a new clause. And I can say, is it and or? Then I have all the different properties. So is it deleted? Is the version current? Access, tier, change time, creation time, deleted time, last access time, last modified, content length, tag count, access tier, blob name, blob type, container metadata value, container name, tag value. And then in any of those things, I could then go, for example, here I could enter a string. But if I selected, in fact, I'm just going to delete that one. But if we looked at, for example, this creation time, did edit, notice for this one, well, it could be a specific date. It could be a specific value. It could be based on blob index tag, or it could be based on the container metadata. So I could go and select and base this value on one of these other things. But hey, I just had that already. I'll put that back to my 60 days. So there's a lot of flexibility in exactly what I want to do with this. I also do have a code view. So this is that same expression that I just put in here, but now it's in code. And you may wonder, well, how do I know if I did this right? One of the nice things we have, if you look in this top corner, preview conditions. So what this will let me do is point to a certain storage account and a container within it. And then it will go through, I could even add a prefix if I wanted to. And based on the rules I've defined, it would show me if it will meet the condition or not. So remember, I said it's a GIF or a JPEG. Okay, so those. And I said it had to be older than 60 days. Well, yep, these are older than 60 days. And it had to have a K between two wildcards. So any number of characters before and then any number of characters after K. So these met all of the conditions. The other files didn't, because these JPEGs, there's no K in the middle of that. And so I know, well, actually my conditions were good. So this makes it super easy to go and evaluate and check, hey, am I doing the right thing? Perfect. Then you'll notice we have the then section. And I can add multiple operations to this. And we can see, let's just add another one, all the different types of operation I can do. I can delete the blob, set a blob immutability policy, set a legal hold, set a tier, undelete, expiry. And obviously I can do multiple of this. I've already done set blob tags. So I can have multiple of these. I can move them up and down. So maybe I want to do whatever this new operation is first. Well, I could move it around. So I can do multiple things. For me, I'm just currently setting a milestone related. So I'm setting it to true. But obviously, I may typically want to actually go and delete this or move it or set the immutability policy. I'm just doing something that doesn't change the data in any way. So I'm just sending a tag, but I could do multiple different things here. And notice I can also add a new condition. So this was, if this is all true, then do this. But I could also then have else. So if it's not true, instead of doing this, well, then go and do this. And again, I can go and set a whole set of different options now, including that sort of blob expiry, etc. So I'm going to delete that section. There's a massive number of different things here I can do now as part of my then. So I had my conditions. If this is met, then I want to do this. And optionally, I could add an else to this as well. So if I think about all of those different capabilities, so I had my conditions, then I had the operations. And for those operations, I can have multiple things that I want to do. And you saw I could also add things like else. completely optional, but I can go and add that. And in terms of what's possible, all of these things are available with the Azure Storage tasks. So I've got all of that flexibility as part of it. Okay, so I've created the task. Now, what do I do with this thing? And this is where I now, once I've defined the task, remember the task is being centrally defined as its own resource. It's not living under any particular storage account. Well, now I go and add n number, excuse me, of assignments. So this is where I can go and say, okay, I'm going to assign this storage task to this particular storage account. Now, as part of the assignment, I could add to be a little bit more specific than the clauses I have here. I could say, well, actually, I only want you to operate on a certain prefix. That's completely optional. I can say, am I applying this based on a schedule? So I want you to do this every day, or it could be one time. Hey, I just want to run this as a one-off thing. And obviously, I can have multiple assignments to multiple different storage accounts all over the place. So if we go and look at that piece, so great, I've got my conditions. Well, now I want my assignments. So we would go and create an assignment. Now, you notice I've already got one here that's completed. It was a single run. If I do create assignment, I want to add a new assignment. I just tell it the storage account. I give it a name, storage 2. Select a role assignment for the managed identity of the storage task. So realize this is running as a certain identity because it can't run as you. It's no good it trying to run as me as the person setting these up. These tasks are made for run for many, many years. I may leave the company. I may change role. And we don't really like to see in the audit logs things done as a human being. We shouldn't have humans with these sort of ongoing high permissions. So what's happening here is the storage task gets its own managed identity. Now, today in preview, it's a system assigned managed identity. Later on down the path, a user assigned managed identity will be available. So I could have the same identity used maybe for different storage tasks. So what's going to happen is the storage task gets its own managed identity, or maybe it's user assigned, so it could be shared for other things. And what has to happen, obviously, if the storage task is running as that identity, it has to have at the data plane, i.e. be able to interact with the blobs, certain roles. So if I think of this managed identity, so hey, great, a storage account, I have all the different data types. I can have lifecycle management policies. Well, the other thing it has is sort of the access management piece. And so what's going to happen is this managed identity will be given a data plane role because it has to be able, when it runs, to have permission to go and interact with the blobs within there. And I get that control. So if we go and look at what that is doing, it's saying, hey, what role do you want to give it? And there's built-in roles. There's different custom roles I might want to use. And it tells you, hey, what are the types of permissions I would need? If we look at the documentation for a second, these are the exact custom permissions I would need for the different types of activities. Obviously, blob data owner can always do any of them. But if I think just enough administration and only give it what it needs, if I know this task is only ever going to change the tier, then maybe I only give it permission to do tier operations. And so it's showing me the particular exact tasks I would need to just do tiering. So I wouldn't give it blob data owner. I would go and create a custom role that just had those in it so I can really think of those minimum possible permissions. So I can go and assign it something. I could further filter it based on some particular prefix if I wanted to, or I could say, no, just run it against everything in the entire storage account. And then I have my trigger. Is it a one-time execution? Or with this? And then I could also say, hey, I want it on a schedule, repeat every some number of days. And it's asking me in both cases for a report export container. It's going to dump out a CSV file of the detail of exactly what it did. It's going to have some JSON files with summaries. I've got this reports container, or it could go and create one for me. And then I would just hit add. And so that's the assignment of that. And that's the key point of this. Now, once you've done that, you need to make sure, now it would go and give this particular managed identity permission. If I went and looked at my storage account for the previous one I did, and if I looked at the different role assignments, image task, notice that image managed identity has storage blob data owner. I did not do just enough. I was like, hey, I trust you. Here's everything. But it has a role on the storage account. So it has to have that permission on every storage account or whatever that custom role is to be able to perform those tasks. And then the final thing is, once you create the storage task, by default, it won't be enabled. So what you'd actually have to go in is come in and click enable. Now it's not going to show it on mine. Mine's already executed. But in the overview, if I look here, you can see my status is active. That's because there was a button up here that said to actually go and enable the task. I've already clicked that. But once you've enabled it, now it will be active and it will run with whatever schedule, whatever you have done as part of that for all the various assignments. And now it's going to go off and do its thing based on that schedule, based on that one-time execution. So it's got the permissions, we do the assignments, and again, we make sure what we go in and do is we enable it. We go and do all of those things. Now, in terms of what this can apply to, so I drew this kind of assignments thing. It can be assigned to any sub, any storage account within your tenant. So it has to be within the same tenant where you've defined the storage task. And then obviously, again, you have to make sure you've set the permission correctly, but it can do any of those things. Now, I mentioned this runs asynchronously. It runs in the background. And I mean, technically, some of these might run for months. You might have this going on for years and years and years. So how do you check the status? So as part of the storage task, you'll also have the ability to go and see your task runs. And there is monitoring information available as well. And now, as you saw, I'd run it once already. So if I go and look at mine, so in this monitoring, you can see, well, it's already showing me under the assignments that, hey, I could do a view task runs from here. But if I just go to task runs, it's going to show me a nice overview. So, hey, in the storage account, it had 507 objects that it went and checked against. 2 of them actually met my conditions. It operated successfully on 2. None of them failed. So I've got that nice summary. And it's showing me, hey, I can view a report. Now, if I view a report, it's downloading from that reports folder. And if I open it up, there'll be a CSV file. And if I drag that over so you can see it, here's the CSV file. And really, we'll see no conditions were met for nearly everything in there. It was my 2 files. And for my 2 files, we can see, yeah, it met the naming, the date, it was successful when it met the condition. If it failed, notice it would show the error description, the error code. It shows us all of the other information about it. So it's going to generate that file. And if I went and looked at the actual storage account for a second, where I created this, and we look to the containers, we'll see that reports folder. Under there's my particular storage task name, there's my particular assignment, there's the execution time, and there's the CSV file. And then there's also summary files, etc. You will also actually notice under the storage account, under my data management, it does list storage tasks as well. So directly within the storage account, I could actually come in here and do an assignment. I could come in and add an assignment for something I want to actually apply here, and in addition to seeing my different assignment runs. So I can do the management locally from the storage account as well. And you saw it showed me, hey, the successes, the failures, and everything else. And that's really the basis of them. So the goal of this is think massive scale. It's elastically scalable. It will have whatever resources it needs to be able to handle billions of different objects. Doesn't matter how many are in the storage account. Now, it is a paid feature. So that's why it's important to not just say, oh, I don't need lifecycle management policies anymore. This is more scalable, more powerful, more flexible, and everything else. And it's also therefore more expensive. Now, the exact pricing is not known yet, but this is something you're going to pay for based, I would assume, on the work it does. That would be very logical for the cloud and consumption-based nature. Maybe it'd be based on number of operations. Maybe it's based on how many it has to go and look at. I don't know. At GA, that will be documented. So go and check that during preview. They're not charging for it at this moment in time. So you can go and try it out. That's obviously an important thing to consider. There is that difference between them. And again, this is why I think about it. Don't just trash, oh, I won't use lifecycle management policies anymore. At a very high level, if all I want to do is at bulk, move some things around in tiers based on a certain number of days or delete stuff, this is free. Lifecycle management policies are free. You can still use it. Now, obviously, it's within a storage account. If I have 100 different storage accounts, hey, I'm redefining this policy on all of them. It's a little bit painful, but it's free. If I have a more complex data estate, if I want to manage costs and data protection and compliance, and I want to do it centrally and then distribute it out, hey, that's where the Azure Storage Actions will come into this. So that's the difference between these different types of capability. And that's really it. I do have a really nice overview page for the particular task, so I can see everything it's doing. I showed that already, but if I just jump back again, if I just go and look over here, look at my task, the overview is going to show me overall how many runs with errors, objects succeeded, objects failed. I can see a nice little chart of it. And then again, I can go into the details of any particular task run and see exactly what happened with there as well. So it's asynchronous, but I can still go and view all the relevant data. And so now we have these choices. I hope that was useful. And until next video, take care.